The vineyard had been quiet that morning, the kind of quiet you only get when the fog is still lifting and the valley hasn't fully woken up yet. Rows of grapevines stretched across the slope, heavy with fruit, leaves brushing softly in the breeze. I was checking irrigation lines when I noticed movement where there normally wasn't any. 2 patrol cars creeping down the narrow dirt access road, lights off but unmistakable. Behind them, standing near the edge of the vines like she owned the place, was the HOA president. Arms crossed. Chin high. That familiar look that said she'd finally found a way to handle me. This wasn't the first time the HOA had complained about the vineyard. From the moment their subdivision went up on the far edge of the valley, they treated my land like an inconvenience. Too rural. Too agricultural. Too visible. They sent letters saying the vines violated community standards, even though my property wasn't in their HOA, never had been, and predated their development by decades. I ignored most of it, until they escalated. According to the police call, I was illegally operating a commercial vineyard on HOA-controlled land and trespassing on property owned by the association. Serious words. Serious accusations. All built on a lie. The officers stepped out of their vehicles calmly, hands resting near their belts but not aggressive. One asked if I was the property owner. Another asked if I had permits for agricultural use. The HOA president hovered just behind them, nodding along to every question, occasionally chiming in to clarify things that weren't true. She claimed the vineyard encroached onto HOA parcels, that residents had complained, that I'd refused to comply with repeated warnings. She spoke fast, confident, like someone who believed volume could replace facts. I listened without interrupting, letting her dig deeper with every sentence. When the officer turned back to me and asked if I had documentation proving ownership, I smiled, not because the situation was funny, but because it was predictable. I'd been expecting this day ever since the HOA started measuring my fence line with tape measures and drones. I told the officers I had everything they needed: recorded deeds, parcel maps, easements, historical surveys, public records, nothing fancy. Then I asked them a question of my own. "Do you want the short version," I said, "or do you want to pull it up directly from the county assessor system?" That question changed everything. The officers glanced at each other. One of them nodded slowly and walked back to his cruiser to run the parcel number I gave him. The HOA president frowned, suddenly less comfortable, insisting there was no need to waste time because she already had the maps. She waved her printed pages like proof. But the valley doesn't care about confidence or laminated paper. It cares about lines drawn decades ago and recorded in ink that doesn't fade. And in a few minutes, just a few, the truth was about to surface in a way she wasn't prepared for. The officer sat in the driver's seat of his cruiser, the glow from the laptop reflecting off his sunglasses as he typed in the parcel number. The valley felt suddenly smaller, like everything was holding its breath. The HOA president continued talking, filling the silence with rehearsed confidence. She explained how the subdivision extended naturally into the surrounding land, how long-term use gave the association certain rights, how residents had always believed the vineyard was community property. She spoke as if belief alone could rewrite boundaries. The officer didn't respond. He just stared at the screen, scrolling slowly, carefully. She handed over her maps next, color-printed, laminated, neatly highlighted. Bright boundary lines wrapped around the vineyard, stopping exactly where she wanted them to. She pointed to a bold label that read HOA-owned green space. One of the officers accepted the papers politely and glanced at them, then looked back toward the cruiser. The contrast was obvious. Her maps were loud. The official records were quiet. And quiet documents tend to win in places like this. A few seconds later, the officer leaned forward, zooming out on the satellite image. Then he zoomed out again. His brow furrowed. The other officer stepped closer to see the screen. The vineyard wasn't inside the HOA boundary. It wasn't even touching it. In fact, the association's entire subdivision sat like a small island at the edge of something much larger. The officer rotated the map, switched layers, and pulled up historical parcel data. The lines stayed exactly where they were. Unmoved. Unimpressed by opinion. "That's not possible," the HOA president said sharply, noticing the change in their body language. She leaned in, trying to see the screen. "You must be looking at the wrong layer. Those records are outdated." The officer didn't argue. He simply pulled up another dataset, county assessor records tied to tax payments going back years. The Vineyard parcels were clearly marked. Owner name listed. Acreage displayed. Then the officer did something no one expected. He zoomed out even farther, revealing the hills, the basin, and the access roads leading into the neighborhood. The silence that followed was heavy. The vineyard wasn't just outside the HOA, it surrounded it. On 3 sides. The access road the HOA used every day cut directly through land that didn't belong to them. The drainage channel feeding their retention pond flowed downhill across the same parcels. One officer finally broke the quiet. "Ma'am," he said, turning to the HOA president, "these records show your association doesn't control this land. At all." Her mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since the patrol cars arrived, she had nothing ready to say. The maps hadn't lied, but not the ones she brought. The officer stepped away from the cruiser and faced me differently now, not confrontational, not suspicious, but curious. The tone had shifted. One of them asked how long I'd owned the land, and I told him the truth. Longer than the HOA had existed, longer than most of the houses on that ridge had even been planned. The other officer asked how much land the deed covered. I didn't give a number right away. Instead, I pointed. First to the vineyard stretching down the slope. Then to the rolling hills behind it. Then to the narrow road cutting through the valley floor. Each gesture added weight, and with every point, the HOA president's posture sank a little lower. The officer followed my line of sight and pulled the map back up, tracing the boundaries I just outlined with his finger. The parcel lines wrapped around the subdivision like a frame. He paused at the access road and tapped the screen. "This road," he said slowly, "is listed as an easement." I nodded. The HOA didn't own it. They had permission to use it. Permission that came with conditions. Conditions they'd never bothered to read. The drainage basin came next. Same situation. Same owner. Same name. Mine. The questions started coming faster now, but they weren't accusatory anymore. They were clarifying. Who maintained the road? Who paid the property taxes on the surrounding land? Who granted access for utility lines and emergency vehicles? Every answer pointed in the same direction. One officer glanced back at the HOA president and asked when the association last reviewed its governing documents. She tried to respond but stumbled over her words, insisting that common understanding mattered just as much as paperwork. The officer didn't react. He was already scrolling through recorded easements and permits. That's when it clicked. One officer finally looked up and said it plainly, almost to himself, "So the HOA isn't enforcing rules on a neighbor. They're operating inside land they don't own." The words hung in the air. He turned to me. "You're the landowner the HOA relies on for access, drainage, and utilities." It wasn't a question. It was a conclusion. The HOA president went pale, her confidence evaporating in real time. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a power reversal. The officer explained what that meant in careful, measured language. Unauthorized structures on private land. Improper signage. Potential civil violations. He wasn't threatening anyone, just stating facts the way law enforcement does when they don't need to raise their voice. The HOA president stared at the vineyard, then at the road, then back at the officers, as if seeing the valley for the first time. She'd come expecting compliance. Instead, she'd triggered a conversation she couldn't control. And the valley, quiet as ever, didn't take sides, it just confirmed who had always owned it. The officers didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. Once ownership was clear, the conversation shifted from debate to consequences. One of them began asking questions that had nothing to do with my vineyard and everything to do with the HOA's behavior. Had the association installed fencing along the road? Posted warning signs? Mounted security cameras near the entrance? The HOA president hesitated, then nodded. She tried to frame it as routine neighborhood management, but the officer stopped her gently. "On land you don't own," he said, tapping the map again. The words landed heavier than any accusation. The second officer walked toward the road, inspecting the signage more closely. The signs bore the HOA's logo, warning of private community property and unauthorized access. He photographed them, then pointed out the fence line running parallel to the vineyard. According to the records, it crossed several feet into my parcel. Not an accident. A choice. The HOA president insisted it was placed based on previous understanding. The officer responded evenly, "Understanding doesn't override recorded property lines." Every sentence stripped another layer of authority from her position. Then came the part she wasn't expecting. The officers explained that calling law enforcement under false pretenses, especially when property records were publicly available, could be considered harassment. Not criminal, but serious enough to document. They also noted that unauthorized use of private land, particularly for infrastructure and surveillance, opened the door to civil liability. The HOA president's confidence collapsed entirely now. She stopped interrupting. Stopped explaining. She just listened, hands clenched, eyes fixed on the ground. One officer turned to me and asked if I'd given the HOA permission to place signs, fencing, or cameras on my land. I said no. Never. Not once. I explained that I'd noticed the installations over time but hadn't removed them, assuming the HOA would eventually correct the overreach themselves. The officer nodded slowly, as if filing away something important. "You've been patient," he said. "More than most." That patience, it turned out, had worked in my favor. Before they left, the officers made one final thing clear to her. The HOA had no enforcement authority here. No right to issue warnings. No right to involve police again without risking further consequences. They recommended the association consult legal counsel before taking any future action related to the land. It wasn't a threat. It was a boundary, drawn as clearly as the lines on the map. The HOA president didn't argue. She didn't protest. She simply nodded, the valley quiet around her, as the reality set in, the power she thought she had never existed. Ready when you are. Part 5 is the aftermath. Silence, apologies, and a vineyard that never moved an inch. The patrol cars rolled away slowly, tires crunching over gravel before disappearing down the access road. The sound lingered for a moment, then faded completely, leaving the valley exactly as it had been before the HOA arrived. Still, open, indifferent to drama. The HOA president didn't leave right away. She stood there alone at the edge of the vineyard, no clipboard, no audience, no authority. Eventually, she turned and walked back toward the subdivision without saying a word. No final warning. No parting shot. Just silence. The kind of silence that settles in after something irreversible has happened. The days that followed were unusually quiet. No letters taped to my gate. No emails citing violations. No final notices. Workers came and went through the valley, tending vines, repairing lines, moving equipment the way they always had. The signs stayed up at first, almost defiant, but the cameras went dark. Then, one morning, the fence section near the road was gone. Clean removal. No damage. No explanation. It was as if the HOA were slowly erasing evidence of its own overreach, hoping attention would drift elsewhere. A week later, a letter arrived. Not from a management company, not stamped with threats or legal language, but from the HOA board itself. The tone was cautious, formal, and carefully worded. It acknowledged a misunderstanding regarding property boundaries, and expressed regret for any inconvenience caused by prior actions. There was no admission of fault, but there didn't need to be. The apology was real enough to confirm what everyone now understood. The HOA had crossed a line it couldn't redraw. The vineyard never changed. The rows stayed where they were. The hills kept their shape. The valley remained open and quiet, just as it had been long before anyone thought to label it a problem. The HOA, on the other hand, did change. Meetings became smaller. Rules became softer. And enforcement, at least in my direction, stopped entirely. Power looks different once it's exposed. It doesn't disappear, it just loses its ability to intimidate. Sometimes people ask why I didn't push harder. Why I didn't sue. Why I didn't force the issue. The truth is simpler. The valley didn't need revenge. It needed clarity. Ownership had been proven. Boundaries had been respected. And the loudest message wasn't delivered through court filings or fines. It was delivered through silence. The kind that comes when everyone finally understands who owns the land, and who never did.